Shortly after dawn on the 19th of March, 1945, the United States aircraft carrier Franklin was steaming closer to the coast of Japan than any American carrier had yet dared, when a single enemy bomber slipped out of the low clouds overhead, dropped 2 bombs onto her flight deck, and vanished. It took only seconds. One of the bombs punched down into the hangar deck, where the ship's own aircraft sat fueled and armed for a strike, and it detonated in the middle of them. In an instant, the Franklin became a floating volcano, a chain of enormous explosions ripping through her as her own bombs, rockets, and ammunition began to cook off, and burning aviation fuel flooded her decks. Hundreds of her men were killed in moments, and in the middle of that inferno, one of the men still alive and moving was the ship's Catholic chaplain, a priest. His name was Joseph O'Callaghan, and by every rule of survival he should have been trying to get off that ship, not deeper into it. The Franklin was, in those first minutes, arguably the most dangerous single place on the planet, a burning, listing steel box packed with high explosives that were detonating one after another with no way to predict which would go next. She was dead in the water, powerless, listing to one side, wrapped in black smoke, only a few dozen miles off an enemy coast. Men were trapped below in compartments filling with smoke. Men were wounded and dying on the open decks. The ship herself was expected, at any second, to be torn completely apart by one of the great magazine explosions still waiting to happen. And into the worst of it, Chaplain O'Callaghan began, deliberately, to move. He was already hurt. O'Callaghan had been wounded by one of the explosions himself, but he barely seems to have registered it. According to his Medal of Honor citation, he groped his way through smoke-filled corridors to reach the open flight deck, and then walked out into what the citation flatly calls the midst of violently exploding bombs, shells, rockets, and other armament. Picture that phrase and hold it. A middle-aged priest, wounded, walking on purpose into the middle of exploding ordnance on a burning deck, because that was where his men were. He had no weapon to fire and no gun to man. What he had was a job that at that moment mattered as much as any gun on the ship, to be with the men who were dying, and then to help save the ones who could still be saved. The first thing he did was the thing a priest is for. Amid the flames and the blasts, O'Callaghan went to the wounded and the dying men scattered across the deck, and he knelt with them. He gave last rites to the dying. He comforted and encouraged the wounded, and, the citation is careful to note, men of all faiths, not only his own. In that fire, a frightened man's religion did not matter to Father O'Callaghan. There is a famous photograph from that day of the chaplain bent over an injured sailor amid the smoke, and it captures the first half of what he was, a shepherd who had walked into hell to be with his flock at the moment they needed him most. But O'Callaghan quickly realized that praying over the dying would not be enough. To save the living, he was going to have to fight the ship's fires himself. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. So the priest became a firefighter and a leader of firefighters. O'Callaghan began organizing the shocked, scattered survivors on the flight deck into working parties, pulling men together, giving them something to do, turning paralyzed terror into action. His citation records it plainly. He organized and led firefighting crews into the blazing inferno on the flight deck. Think about what that leadership meant in that moment. All around these men, the ship was exploding. Every instinct screamed to run or freeze. And here was the chaplain, not an officer of the line, not a gunnery boss, but the Padre, calmly gathering them, pointing them at the fires, and walking into the flames at the front of them, so they would follow. In a disaster that could easily have become blind panic, O'Callaghan became one of the still points that others could organize themselves around. And then, he went after the most dangerous thing on the ship, the ammunition. The greatest threat to the Franklin was not the fire itself, but what the fire could set off. The bombs and shells stored in her magazines and sitting in her gun turrets, which the spreading heat could detonate at any moment and blow the ship in half. So O'Callaghan led men directly at that danger. He manned a fire hose himself to cool red-hot, armed bombs before they could explode. He directed the jettisoning of live ammunition, getting it thrown over the side, away from the fire. And, most astonishingly, he personally led parties of men into the blazing, superheated gun turrets and magazines, where they picked up live shells by hand and carried them out to the edge of the ship and threw them into the sea one after another, knowing that any one of those shells could go off in their arms. It is hard to overstate the nerve that took. To walk into a burning turret and lift a hot shell that might detonate at your touch and carry it calmly to the rail and then go back and do it again is a kind of courage most of us can barely imagine, and O'Callaghan did it not once but repeatedly, and led other men to do it with him. Survivors of the Franklin would remember the chaplain seeming to be everywhere at once that morning, kneeling with a dying man one moment, heading a fire hose the next, then leading a line of sailors out of a magazine with live rounds in their arms. He had appointed himself, without any order to do so, to the single most dangerous work on a ship where all the work was deadly. And slowly, foot by foot, hose by hose, shell by shell, it began to make a difference. Because the Franklin impossibly did not blow apart. The fires that should have reached her main magazines were fought to a standstill. The ammunition that should have detonated was cooled, or thrown into the sea, or kept just barely under control, by O'Callaghan and by other brave men working the same nightmare all over the ship. The great final explosion that everyone braced for never came. And that meant the impossible was suddenly on the table. This gutted, burning, powerless wreck might actually be saved. But saving the ship was not the same as saving her men, and the chaplain's other work, the work he had started with, was far from over. Below decks, hundreds of men were still trapped in the dark and the smoke. And that is where the story turns from the fire back to the people. Stay with the men on the Franklin, because that is the heart of this. And if stories like this are why you're here, subscribe, because keeping the names of people like Joseph O'Callaghan alive is the entire point of this channel. Throughout the fight for the ship, O'Callaghan never stopped being her chaplain. In between the fire hoses and the shells, he kept going back to the wounded, kneeling with the dying, and moving among terrified men with a calm that was, by every account, contagious. He was not fearless. No sane man in that situation is fearless, but he had mastered his fear so completely that others could borrow his composure. A frightened sailor who saw the Padre walking upright and unhurried through the smoke, stopping to help, could believe, for a moment, that survival was possible. In a catastrophe, that steadiness is worth more than almost anything. And O'Callaghan was not the only man performing miracles aboard the Franklin that day. In the smoke-filled darkness below decks, another officer, a lieutenant named Donald Gary, discovered around 300 men trapped in a blacked-out mess compartment, slowly suffocating with no idea how to get out. Gary calmed them, found a path through the smoke and the wreckage, and then led them out in the dark, and, not satisfied with saving them once, went back into the smoke again and again to guide out group after group. For that, Donald Gary would receive the Medal of Honor too. It is worth remembering that the Franklin was saved not by one man, but by many acts of courage like his, all over the ship, and that O'Callaghan, moving everywhere with his hoses and his last rites, had become the visible symbol of all of them. By the end of that terrible day, the impossible had happened. The USS Franklin, burning, gutted, listing, hundreds of her crew lost, was still afloat. She had not exploded. Her surviving crew, rallied and organized and refusing to abandon her, brought her under control, and in time she was taken under tow and then, remarkably, steamed away from the coast of Japan under her own power. She would ultimately cross the Pacific and the Atlantic and reach the Brooklyn Navy Yard, one of the most heavily damaged warships ever to make it home. She had been, quite literally, dragged back from death by the men aboard her, and among the most important of those men was the priest who had walked into her fires with nothing but a hose, a prayer, and a refusal to leave anyone behind. Which raises the question that makes this story more than just a tale of one terrible morning. Who was he? Who was this middle-aged priest who ran the wrong way, into the fire, when every survival instinct said run the other way, and who turned out to have the nerve to carry live shells out of a burning magazine by hand? He was not a career naval officer. He was not, by his own account, even a naturally brave man in the physical sense. To understand how a Jesuit mathematics professor ended up as the calm center of one of the worst disasters in U.S. Navy history, we need to leave the burning deck for a moment and go back to a classroom in Massachusetts. This is the man underneath the legend. Let us widen the lens all the way back. Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan was born in 1905 in Boston, Massachusetts, and as a young man he chose the priesthood, joining the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, an order famous for its intellectual rigor, in 1922. He was, by any measure, a scholar rather than a warrior. He became a professor, and not of anything soft. He taught mathematics, philosophy, and physics, and by the late 1930s he was the director of the mathematics department at the College of the Holy Cross. Picture the man the Franklin's crew did not yet know they had, a bookish, brilliant Jesuit priest, a professor of higher mathematics, whose whole life had been spent in chapels and classrooms and lecture halls. Nothing about that life obviously prepares a man to carry live bombs across a burning aircraft carrier, and yet, when the war came, that is exactly where he chose to go. As the world slid toward war, O'Callaghan decided that he could do more good in uniform than in a classroom, and in August of 1940 he joined the United States Navy Reserve as a chaplain. It was, in a way, an unlikely choice for him. By some accounts he disliked tight, enclosed spaces, which is a hard thing to carry onto a warship, where a man spends his life inside a steel hull below the waterline. But he went anyway. He served first aboard the carrier Ranger, seeing action in the North Atlantic and off North Africa, learning the sea and the men who sailed it. He was not a stranger to danger when he came to the Franklin. But nothing in that earlier service, or in a lifetime of mathematics and prayer, could have fully prepared him for what waited 17 days after he stepped aboard his new ship. The USS Franklin was a large fleet aircraft carrier, one of the powerful Essex-class ships that formed the striking heart of the American fleet in the Pacific by 1945. That March, the U.S. carriers had pushed in dangerously close to the Japanese home islands themselves, launching airstrikes against targets on the mainland in the final phase of the war. And operating that near to Japan meant operating within reach of Japanese aircraft. It was a bold, aggressive, and risky position, and the Franklin was at the sharp edge of it. O'Callaghan had reported aboard on the 2nd of March. For just over 2 weeks he settled into the rhythms of the ship, learned his new congregation of thousands of sailors and airmen, held his services, and then on the 19th a single plane came out of the clouds, and the ordinary life of the ship ended in a matter of seconds. So hold the whole picture now. A bookish Jesuit mathematician, a professor who by his own admission was uneasy in tight spaces, who joined the Navy to comfort men rather than to fight, and who had been aboard his burning ship for barely 2 weeks when the worst day of her life arrived. Knowing who he was before makes what he did that morning more remarkable, not less. The courage O'Callaghan showed on the Franklin was not the reflex of a trained warrior. It was the deliberate choice of a gentle, thoughtful man who decided, in the middle of an inferno, that his fear mattered less than his men. And what the Navy and the nation did to recognize that choice, and what became of the Professor Priest afterward, is the last part of the story. When the accounts of that day were gathered, what Joseph O'Callaghan had done stood out even among so much courage, and the Navy moved to decorate him. And here the story reveals one more thing about the man. The Navy first approved for him the Navy Cross, an extraordinarily high honor in its own right. O'Callaghan declined it. By the accounts that come down to us, he was reluctant to be singled out and set above the many other men who had fought to save the ship. It ultimately took the personal persuasion of the President of the United States, Harry Truman, to get him to accept an even higher award, because the Navy and the nation had concluded that what he had done merited the very highest honor there was. And so, at the White House, Joseph O'Callaghan received the Medal of Honor. In receiving it, he made history. Joseph O'Callaghan became the first Navy chaplain ever to be awarded the Medal of Honor, the first man of the cloth in the sea services to receive his nation's highest decoration for valor, given not for taking life but for saving it, in the middle of the worst fire the Navy had seen. And then, characteristically, he went back to being who he had always been. The war ended. O'Callaghan returned to the College of the Holy Cross and to his students and his mathematics, and he wrote a modest, honest account of that day called simply, "I was chaplain on the Franklin." He carried the effects of the ordeal for the rest of his life. He died in 1964 on the 18th of March by a strange coincidence, one day short of the 19th anniversary of the fire he had walked into. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan, Jesuit priest, professor of mathematics, and chaplain of the United States Navy, walked, wounded, into the middle of an exploding aircraft carrier, gave last rites to the dying and comfort to the frightened, led firefighting crews into the flames, cooled armed bombs with his own hands on a hose, and led men into burning magazines to carry live shells out to the sea, and by doing so helped save a ship that everyone expected to blow apart, and the hundreds of men still aboard her. He became the first Navy chaplain to earn the Medal of Honor. The Navy later named a ship for him. Somewhere, the descendants of the men O'Callaghan pulled back from that fire are alive today because a mathematics professor decided to run toward the flames. We tend to picture courage as something a soldier carries into an attack, a weapon in the hand, an enemy in front. Joseph O'Callaghan had no weapon and attacked no one. His whole heroism was the opposite of destruction. He ran into a fire, empty-handed, to drag other men out of it. And maybe that is the purest kind of courage there is, the kind that spends itself entirely to save and asks for nothing, and then quietly goes back to teaching mathematics. Most people have never heard his name, and that is exactly why places like this comment section matter. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather served aboard the USS Franklin or on any ship in the Pacific, or came home from that war and rarely spoke of it, leave their name below and tell us one thing about them, one thing they did or said or that you remember. The ones who ran toward the fire deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.